Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Don Robinson. You are tuned to the I just double checked myself there. Yeah, May 2021 edition of SM Advanced Forum, your monthly roundup of news and gossip in and around the technology and business of streaming. Now, if I press the right buttons, I am, as always, joined by my erstwhile co-host, Tim Siglin. Tim, are you out there?
I think I am, Dom. Can you hear me?
I even managed to remove the spotlight in time to switch to you. How are you, sir?
I'm doing really well. Looking forward to a good conversation today.
Good, excellent. And I think we should have Mark as well. Mark, are you with us?
I am, sir. How are you?
Yes, very good. I love the backgrounds you have. It
looks like
shows mine up
the Aurora Borealis for some reason. So.
I'm in Iceland today. Yes.
Excellent. How have you been, Mike? You all right? Been busy?
Yeah, man. Just busy as always with the kids and with the work. We're starting to see on-site actual live production coming back into full swing. I mean, we've got a full load at this point, so it's not all virtual all of a sudden, which is great.
Great. What's
good to see it come back.
How are you jetting around between the real events and staying at home with the kids?
Yeah, I mean, we've got more people now, so that's a good thing. But I'm having to travel less. It's just everything that we're talking about this week and last week is all on site all of a sudden, and that was certainly not the case very recently. So these are things that are in June and July and August, but yeah, everyone's the gloves are off and everyone's starting to get back into it. So.
The ice is thawing, as somebody said the other day.
Yeah,
and Mark, we'll want to come back to that as a topic a bit later in the show, but I'll be interested to know, everybody's talking hybrid. You all have done a lot of online virtual, and now you're back to live, like you said, like you had in the past, and sort of where you expect that's going to play out. So.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about it. I think, primarily the live stuff that I'm talking about is stuff that just wasn't happening. It's sports and entertainment related stuff. All of the corporate stuff is still very much hybrid or digital first, and probably will be for a while. I have some pretty strong opinions on that, but yeah, it's that is business as usual, whatever usual means these days.
And Tim, you're finally up with HM Smurf, as I keep calling it, Her Majesty's Smurf, HM SRF, isn't it? Tell us about.
Right. So we got our official 501c3, which is for people outside of the States. That's our charitable solicitation status. We're Help Me Stream Research Foundation, and the focus on that originally was just to work in emerging economies, to take donations of technology gear here in the States, repurpose them into media servers and media distribution, and get them to NGOs in emerging economies. But we've had a number of people ask us about helping with the digital divide, even here in the States, in the rural communities. I live in a rural community, and as you know, Dom, sometimes my network connection's rock solid. Sometimes it's not.
That's what you're talking about, Tim.
Right. So, and I can drive 3 minutes from here and be in places where people have no connection and will probably not have connection for another couple of years, unless there's a big push to do things like streaming and broadband. And I think that's one of the topics we're going to sort of touch on here in a little bit too. But yeah, we're now finally a full official 501c3, so I can hit people up for money to help with the mission that we're doing.
Cool, excellent. Well, cap in hand in the Patreon, I look forward to, Tim. So, Tim, why don't you take over and take us into meet who we've got on the guest seats this month?
Certainly, and we'll do ladies first here. So, Tamar, tell us a little bit about yourself. You don't need to talk about your company unless you want to, but just kind of your time in the industry.
So, hi, I'm Tamar. I'm very proud to belong to Beamer as VP Technology. I've been with them basically since the inception, a bit over 11 years ago. And I'm responsible for the algorithm development, our booming IP portfolio. So it's I have 3 children, so this is my 4th. So of course you have to name it by name, right? I've been basically in video for 21 years. Before that, I did pure algorithms, more mathematical stuff. And the joke is my boss then came into the room one day and said, we have to make a decision. H.263 was just happening then, VOD, you know, and we have to make a decision if we're going to stop developing algorithms and shift to video. Because everybody knows there's no mathematics in video, right? So 20 years later, I'm still doing algorithms for video very happily.
Nice. Well, my one thing I didn't mention, my wife, I got married last year. My wife is a math teacher. Her late husband was a math teacher. We bought a farm, and we have actually just launched a company called Farm Tech, which is algorithms for agriculture, where we're trying to do mathematics around things like milking machines. Has nothing to do with video. Well, I say nothing to do with video. There will be a video component, I'm certain, but it's fascinating to hear you talk about people saying there's math here, but there's not math here. We know in our industry, of course, in streaming, there's tons of math, and we'll get a chance to talk about some of that during this hour. So very good. And then David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Mcclarty. I currently work for a company called Deliver, who specialize in optimization and measurement of video. We do it from a very unique way. I've been working for them for around 5 years. I've been in streaming, I think, since approximately 2000. I started my career, you don't want the long story, I'm sure. I started my career, I used to balance turbines for a living in aero engines. And then I got into radio. I was a radio host for the Beeb, and then I got into commercial and decided there was no money in it. And then I became an engineer for the BBC, and as they say, the rest all went downhill till I met Mark East, who gave me a job working for him for another company. And I spent many a happy late into the night watching golf for a well-known broadcaster in the US. And to this day, I hate golf so much you have no idea.
So it really is tedious to watch.
I was going to say, especially, I mean, at least the camera quality for PGA Tour is pretty good. When you look at some of the lower level, like FedEx and some of the other ones, those, yeah, you don't even know where the ball is on the screen. Little, nice.
Yeah, it's the commentary mainly.
So Mark, you and David have known each other for quite some time, I take it. What can you give us a great story about David that the audience would like to hear?
Oh, I could, but nothing that David would want me to share.
Oh, boring. Come on, Mark.
Mark introduced me to highly priced cocktails in the Bellagio at an NAB many years ago. And it's one of those moments, although I remember very little, I remember just enough, but I will take that to my grave with me, Mark. You have no problem.
Fantastic.
Did you go to Parasol Up, or did you go to one of the other martinis?
It was definitely there, but we were also at the Akamai party at what's it called? Chandelier 1.5 at Cosmo.
Oh,
Cosmo,
where they always have, it's just open bar for hours and hours, and it's these $16 craft cocktails. So that was a good way to kick off the evening, and it proceeded from there. It was a good time. We had so at the time, David and a fine gentleman named Saad Abbas were running that facility of ours in London, and we had them come over for some training and a visit to NAB, and it was just kind of a week-long party. It was good. It was good times. Not much that I can share, but it was good.
Very well. Okay, so one of the topics we wanted to talk about today was Codex, and I figure we ought to just jump into this. And Dom, if you would bring up the chart of what he seems to be talking about, where we are looking at the long tail of AVC or H.264 and the uptake on AV1, AV2, and H.265. Dom, I'll go to guests first. So Tamar, you work in a company who's worked, obviously, you said you worked in H.263, then H.264, and H.265. Has H.264's longevity surprised you, or?
Yes, so I must say, if someone would have come 10 years ago and showed me this graph and said, you know, he can guarantee the numbers for 2021, I would have considered them to be crazy. I mean, we all knew that 263 was the first one that really took for video on demand, and 264, MPEG-4 Part 10, you know, took over very clearly. There was a time we believed that the entirety of MPEG-4 with all the audio-visual objects and synthetic video would take, and that never did.
Well, it became flash video for about 15 years.
yeah, but it never became, you know, the default that the map behind you is not a synthetic audio-visual object being created, you know, right. Generated on the other side. So that didn't quite happen. And it kind of felt natural that, you know, 10 years down the line, H.265 or HEVC would just be the norm. And at Beamer, we developed Codec SDKs, and we had a world-leading AVC encoder. And then they started working on the HEVC, and it was clear that, you know, that's what we want to focus on, and that's where it's going. And then we realized what was happening on these graphs, fortunately, in advance enough to go back and say, no, 264 isn't going anywhere. We need to keep investing effort in that as well as HEVC. And I think, you know, even 3 years ago, it was so clear that HEVC was going to take, and there was a big announcement from Apple that it was backing HEVC full strength. And, you know, that was the final thing. It was going to happen. And it isn't really happening at the rate we expected. So I think the biggest surprise to me in that graph is, you know, where the 264 line is. And you mentioned, and I can't disagree, that it might even stay higher than it looks like on the graph at the moment. I do think the estimation for AV1 adoption might be a bit pessimistic, because I think if they can really resolve the licensing issues, which isn't clear. I mean, we all know that Sysvel is making claims now that haven't been fully refuted yet. But if they can counter that and the licensing is clear, and we start seeing it even in hardware, say 2025, I imagine the curve will be a bit steeper.
Interesting. You know, I, having done work for On2 when it was VP7 and VP8 before the move into VP9, there really was the expectation even at that point that with Google, you know, sort of moving heavily into the video space, that we would see an uptick in VP9 and a drop off in 264. Obviously, that didn't happen, or didn't happen the way that we anticipated. Dom, you also sort of feel like 264, that curve that you showed, isn't going to drop off as rapidly as what is anticipated in this particular graph.
I mean, I'm not convinced that anything's come along that fixes a problem for a customer at the end of the day. I think for the infrastructure providers, there's lots of reason to go with new codecs. But H.264 for the customer isn't broken. So there's going to be a continued easy consumption of that. Devices that can consume that, and as the lowest common denominator, if you want to encode something in, you know, new codec A, let's not pick one, let's just say new codec A. If you want to encode something and put it out in the market, you're inevitably also going to contribute to the H.264 pile and encode a version in H.264, or at least have a system which can make it available on the fly in H.264. So like MP3, it's not going to go away. And if anything, it's going to hit its limits of licensing, or what was it with MP3, 25 years or something? It's going to hit some limits of IPR protection, and suddenly it's going to be open source, at which point it's free to put it on an embedded chip. There's tons of tech out there that's doing it. So you know, undoubtedly there are better codecs, undoubtedly there are more efficient things, and they need to be developed for specific use cases, especially in production workflows or in, I don't know, CCTV or whatever it may be, and so on. So there's all sorts of reasons to develop new codecs, but mass market adoption, I think, is going, you know, Google pushing Roku at the moment to force them to add the expense of an AV1 decoder is going to raise questions with the Monopolies Commission. And I think enough people are going to say, well, okay, we won't put YouTube on the chip then, and it'll change the market dynamic. And so it's interesting. It's all woken up in the Codex space in the last few weeks, which is interesting because I think there's limited real innovation for the consumer out there.
So,
it's a bit funny to see the equivalent in images, because I mean, we do video and image optimization. We actually started with image optimization, and when we started 11 years ago, and we were going to work with JPEG and convert them to newer formats, and in the end discovered that what the market actually want is just a more optimized JPEG, and we're still making JPEGs. And not only that, there's a huge demand to turn HEIC, the HEVC based image format, into JPEGs for legacy support. And JPEG, I mean, my God, that is like from the 80s, and it's
I was going to say, can we call HEIC JPEG 2020 now as opposed to JPEG 2000?
Yeah, right. So I guess what happened in image, and Google tried. They had WebM and WebP, and everybody's tried, and nobody has knocked JPEG off the pedestal. And I think we're seeing the same with H.264.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? Where is the what's the company, the Italian patent troll that's after the AV1 submarine codex? Is that actually holding things up?
The Sysvel?
Sysvel, that's it. Are they
They've
holding things up, or is that
issued a set of claims, and I don't think anyone has fully countered them yet, but I don't think it's gone to court yet, as far as I know.
Right.
Well, and
I mean,
remember back
before
we had Acacia. Was it Acacia or Acacia that did the patent claims way back then with 264, and that it slowed things down for about 1.5 to 2 years. So you mentioned the still image codex. It's interesting because you mentioned Apple too, with Apple supporting HEVC. Of course, they are supporting HEIC in their still image, the cameras on the phones, and they do a really good job of that. But I've noticed recently that if I send it to somebody who's not on an iPhone, it automatically converts it back to JPEG, which is...
Yeah, I can tell you why that happens, because before they did that, and we had this site that did HEIC to optimize JPEG, sort of as a, we were testing the waters and giving it as a free service. And we were getting responses from users like, you saved me. My doctor sent me a file I couldn't open, and you helped me convert it to JPEG. Okay, so they must have, seen that mistake, and now they automatically convert it.
So, David, I'm going to go to you real quick and ask you a question. Then I want to come back to Mark on 264. But one of the things you'd wanted to talk about as a topic is legacy technologies. We're talking about an image codec scenario here that's 40 years old with JPEG. It's about 24, 25 years old with 264, because I worked with it in video conferencing before I came into streaming. At what point do we say, from a legacy standpoint, enough is enough, we're moving on? Or do we have different variations of what's considered legacy as we go forward?
That's a really expansive question.
Sorry.
I think we're going to discuss standards later. And I think my own opinion is there's many a good tune played on an old piano, which is a get out of jail free quote. And you can quote me on that if you like. The issue here is, are we going to leave people behind? Are we going to push them down a route that they're going to need to continually get off the hamster, they stay on the hamster wheel rather to keep on upgrading their hardware? Admittedly, things like Codex aren't as resource intensive as they used to be, but at the same time, a good open standard probably is a good thing, because really, when somebody's publishing something, the most important thing is bums on seats, eyes in front of the glass, and that's really should always be our first endeavor. That's my own personal opinion.
And are they, just to follow on that, are the codecs not as processor intensive because the processors have gotten better, or because we've gotten better at optimizing the codecs themselves so that they run on less powerful hardware? And I asked that thinking back to when I worked with On2, one of the goals there was every time they came out with a new version of the codec, they wanted it to run on even older and older legacy gear. So VP7 could run on a 1.2 gigahertz processor. VP8 was designed to run on a 700 megahertz processor. And obviously, megahertz isn't the differentiator necessarily, but they wanted to get better imaging at lower processing requirements.
My first experience with encoding with Codex was when I worked for a well-known chip manufacturer called Intel, and we had a rack of 2U blade servers. This is early 2000, I think, and to get a 360-240 for Windows Media was absolutely toasting those machines, really was. And I think probably I think Tamar's probably got a much better explanation for this than me, but I think probably the algorithms got better, but at the same time, it's that, I can't remember the name for it, but the exponential increase in the ability of power versus the amount of money it costs. I think it got to a sweet spot. I don't know if you agree, but I think that's probably most likely.
Very interesting you say that, Dave, because there was an article we dropped into the SMath feed that I'm just frantically flipping for. That
Moore's law being broken.
There we go. Moore's law isn't broken, if I've got it right. And this is fascinating.
Moore's law, that's what I was looking for. Sorry.
Yeah.
Named after one of the Intel founders, Gordon Moore.
Yeah. Shame on me.
Yeah. So if you've got the feed there, yeah. So basically, this is an interesting discussion that for Moore's law typically improves about, we see an annual improvement performance of about 40%. But what we're seeing now is massive exponential improvements because we're incorporating so many different types of core. Basically, we've got the ability to use GPU and back off capability into other mathematical elements of the CPU, and it is it is interesting how the performance you're getting now, because of the types of calculations that we're trying to do, is actually far outstripping Moore's law, which is interesting. A change in how we're doing things. It almost leads us into that article, actually, Tim.
Yeah, it really does, actually.
Almost takes us into the Facebook AI.
But before we do that, let me come back to Mark, because Mark's on the ground doing production. Mark, AV1, HEVC, H264. I mean, before 6 months ago, you told us 264 is still dominant. Is that the case today as well? I mean, are you seeing requests for it has to be put out in AV1?
In the live space, in AV1, absolutely not. But in the live space, I mean, it'll be H.264 for still a long time yet. I think the analogy that you could draw is the adoption of NTSC video in the 40s and 50s. You know, it's when everyone bought a TV, and that's where we standardized, and that's where it stayed for a long time. How many decades did we have a solution for higher definition video? And, you know, standards came and went, and nothing was adopted until relatively recently because there was no compelling reason for it, and no one wanted to abandon their old production workflows and their, you know, all of the installed base of you know, good old fashioned 480 TVs that were out there. I think that the same thing could be said for H.264. H.264 came to, you know, its peak when everyone was jumping on the live and SVOD and AVOD video bandwagons, and so we've got, you know, a bunch of devices out there that you know, speak H.264, and there's no super compelling reason unless you're interested in saving money on your infrastructure to adopt anything more advanced than that. My question is, what happens when everyone's on 5G and the programming becomes richer? It's not just, you're not just watching a single program, you're watching some sort of rich multimedia, presentation of, live sports with, multi-stream video that you're, switching back and forth. Not that that's not possible today, but, for sure, Verizon, for example, is driving a ton of multicam live sports endeavors with regard to their 5G networks and that sort of thing. So when that happens and your data rates are at a premium, then what? Then there's a compelling reason to start adopting it across the board, I think. And what are your thoughts on that? I feel like that's when we'll start really seeing some adoption of 265 for one thing, and then into the more advanced AV1, AV2, that sort of thing.
I think one of the things we haven't mentioned and is definitely going to be a driver, and maybe that's what you were pointing to, Mark, is the 4K and the HDR, which 264 doesn't have a good enough answer for.
True.
And I mean, nowadays, it's my understanding, at least in the US, that, most televisions support 4K and HDR, the newer televisions, the newer models. And at some point, consumers are going to say, but, how do I get my money's worth? How do I watch the 4K, the HDR, the really premium end of the content? And I think that's what's going to be a large part of what pushes us beyond 264.
That's a really excellent point. And I think the home viewers, they have equipment and have had equipment for years now that will consume HDR content. It's only recently that everyone walking around with an Apple device at least has a device in their pocket that can produce and consume Dolby Vision and Atmos, video and audio, which requires a pretty substantial data stream to to consume. And so, yeah, I think the codec becomes a crucial part of that equation. And I think we're going to see some pretty fierce adoption of that type of content coming very shortly, just as a result of Apple's decision to include that in the more recent OSs.
One thing I think Apple did right with this new 4K Apple TV is they've got that ability now with your phone to put it up and color calibrate your television. That was an utterly brilliant move, because we all talk about optimizing. And if you remember, what was it, about 2 years ago, Tom Cruise came out when there was I think one of the Blu-ray versions of Mission Impossible, and asked people to, calibrate their televisions. It's a really hard thing to do. And as soon as I saw that they were essentially using the phone as that O-scope, so to speak, it says, if we can get people to optimize this stuff, then they'll start noticing the difference. I think even though they have the devices, they don't really notice the difference because it's not optimized from that standpoint. My personal take is we still have a whole lot of MPEG-2 out there. If I go buy a Blu-ray disc for my little girls, it comes with a DVD that's MPEG-2, just in case me paying that $20 for the Blu-ray, I don't have a Blu-ray disc player. So MPEG-2 has lived on for decades. 264, I think, will live on for decades, even as 265 or AV1 come in to address the HDR piece of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the shock in the industry is not that it's lived on, it's that it's lived on at the top of the bell curve. I mean, we're nowhere near the long tail of H.264. So
no, I totally agree. I think that graph was missing. What that graph should have shown is a flat line for H.264 and everything relative to H.264, which would have made their growth look steeper. It would have been a better way to interpret that graph, but it gives the impression that H.264 is going to somehow tail away, and I just don't believe that.
And to be clear, that graph refers only to VOD transcoding, correct? It's media transcoding workflow, which is the most ambiguous data point I've ever heard of. So right, I'm wondering, does that include live and live linear, or is it just VOD?
And also, I'm minded. So I think something we haven't touched on here really is there's the cacheability of content in CDN is a big economic driver, and it's the most immediate one over and above the bandwidth itself. It's the cacheability of the files. So at the moment, we've just been doing some demos with Akamai, which are implementing an RFC, which means that you can put one chunk out and deliver it in all the different LL, HLS, LL dash, normal HLS, CMAP. It all goes out as one chunk through the CDN, which we've implemented with H.264. I'd need to go back to the team to find out how easy it is to do that with other codecs. But I should imagine if it's not easy to do that with codecs, CDNs are going to be more and more disinclined to support them cheaply. And they might start differentiating the cost of codecs, because one type might be very cheap and efficient to cache across the network, but another type of codec may not represent the same sort of cost efficiency. So
well, and there's also
that's something that's easy to forget about.
I was going to say there's another piece to that too, Dom, in byte range addressing, of course, for MP4 files. You have that ability through the stuff that Vivek and some of the other guys did with cut-through caching to ultimately hold those in different parts of the database as well, because you cache as a database of content that, as you say, can be repackaged out. It does change, the question is, do you want to make two copies? Do you want to make an AV1 copy, or do you want to make a H.264 copy? Or do you do like you're suggesting, where essentially you put it in a baseline media file format like we have, and then chop it up, and potentially even transcode it on the fly? Tamar, we've talked about encoding, but you've worked with transcoding as well. Obviously, we've had issues in the past with concatenation and that kind of thing. Where do we stand in the industry right now with transcoding between different formats like AV1 or H.265 from a baseline media file format?
So I think people are more aware than they used to be about the need to be able to transcode between platforms, and even between profiles or bit rates in the same platform, and to be able to really provide efficient ABR ladders. But it's always an issue. I mean, when you're transcoding, you need to configure the target encoding correctly so that you determine, do you lose quality? Do you gain bit rate? And in a way, it's a similar problem to the content adaptive encoding that we do, because you need something to drive it. So we use perceptually driven optimization to reduce a bit rate either within the same codec, or it can be used also for transcoding cross codec. And I think that's one of the reasons that groups or companies are so fearful to switch over codecs. So there's the legacy infrastructure, but there's also, okay, I have this new codec, but I have 10 years of experience, 20 years of experience configuring for my clients and my use cases or my workflows. If you're giving me a new codec now, I have to start from scratch. And I think, so that's an excellent point that you're raising, Tim, about the transcoding and going from one codec to another. There's a challenge, but I mean, there are companies like Beamer who can help overcome that challenge. But even with that, it's always going to be, you have to have someone, and the guy who did the recipes for 264 left 10 years ago, and, we don't touch that. So that's always an issue.
When I worked with the company that had, I mentioned before we started, that was doing the content-aware encoding, put out the H.265 library, came back to do the 264 one. They did it because when they would take it to large media companies who had 264 workflows, it was almost like you were asking them to relearn not just the codec parameters itself, but also the workflow. And it is interesting to hear you say that. David, one of the topics you had mentioned was bandwidth, and I think Mark or Dom alluded to that, where we're talking about having bandwidth to consume HDR content, to consume 4K content. What's your take on the reality of bandwidth to the consumer, whether it's 4G, 5G, or their wire connection in the home? Are the ISPs being truthful with what they say about the average level of bandwidth in a given region?
I think I have to be careful what I say, because obviously an ISP or a CDM probably can afford higher priced lawyers than I can. I've
Fair point.
noticed many times, I mean, I talk to people all over Europe. That's my patch. So and especially during the first couple of months of what we had over here as lockdown. I hate that word so much. When I was speaking to several ISPs themselves, they were getting no end of complaints from their customers, simply because they had been led to believe that they would be able to watch 4K 24 hours a day, not a problem. You know, they thought they would be able to do it. Maybe they hadn't got the correct interconnects with the SVOD provider, but quite often the whole thing ground to an absolute sludge of a problem. Southern Europe especially has a massive issue with ones and noughts to the actual device. Not so much further north. If you get into the Nordics especially, I mean they've had, you know, massive open pipes for decades. It's a different world. But I think an ISP tells you one thing, and what you actually get is quite often very different. For my own purposes, when I ask people to actually chat, and I'm sure you guys are all aware, but you know, when you do a speed test at home, that's not really what you're getting. You need to use something like fast.com to give you a roughly good indication. And I think also a lot of publishers are sometimes not getting the service that they paid for with their CDN until it comes up to time for contract renewal, when suddenly the wastegate gets opened again and they get wonderful throughput. And I think it's very difficult for a consumer. When it comes to wireless, obviously the laws of physics are the further away you get from the cell tower, the lower the bit rate that you're going to actually get on your device. And I think it's difficult to actually judge that fairly. You're not going to actually measure, I'm 3 kilometers from the cell, I should be getting 4 to 7 megabits a second. But you know, through to the door, I think consumers have been misled for a long time, and I think a lot of them have become very wise to this.
And how widespread is adoption of fiber in Europe and the UK? I know there were these fiber to the home councils that were pushing a decade ago. Places like Portugal, you know, to raise the number of doors that they passed with fiber. Here in the States, it's still primarily all copper.
I mean, you've got the joy. I know people who are early adopters of Starlink, and I think that's probably going to be a really good option for one of my best bud who lives in quite near the Bay Area. He lives a little bit out in the sticks, and his DSL speed was it's almost not good enough to do a Zoom call with. He's got Starlink now, and admittedly it's a little bit still in beta, so you can drop up and down, but he gets good throughput. Now in Europe, it really depends which country you go to. Our government's very bullish at the moment, hot on the thing about we've cured the world now from COVID, and they're going to invest stop giggling, you lot. They're investing a stack of cash to try and get it into rural areas. But I think the real problem is it depends on the topography of where you are, and you know how densely populated your areas are. So for Portugal, for instance, which I'm very keen on that country. It's wonderful. You have 4 or 5.
I totally agree.
I agree as well. So
it's what if, by the way, if you're watching this and you haven't booked your summer holiday, go to Portugal. Those guys are awesome. There's 5 or 6 areas of fairly large population, but the rest of it it's fields. So for a country like that, it's not going to be a huge job to actually fiber everybody up. The problem really is getting somebody to actually put their hand in their pocket and be a little bit pointy-headed to get it done. And I think it's a really a question of probably it goes into politics really. If enough people complain to the people in power, they might put a bit of pressure on their donors or corporations that rely on tax relief. I'm sure I'm not the only person that's ever thought that.
So
I have fiber to the door, by the way.
I want to chip in actually, because it's a topic that's I'm quite close to. I've been involved in the ISP and internet policy for a long time, and specifically around CDN and content delivery and so on. And something that does slightly irk me is there's always a rush to push the newest, fastest technology, and in particular, I think 5G's licensing is going to take some time before we're going to see speeds that actually bring anything to streaming over 5G. And I think it's a shame that the 4G networks weren't delivered more ubiquitously before the capital investment moved to the latest hype in the 5G market. And I think that's typical of marketing in not just the ISP speed world, but the problem space that we talk about often in streaming and compression bit rates and so on. We often talk about chasing these very high 4K, 16K, 444 UHD speeds as if it drives the TV market, and that's a good thing. But actually, 2 megabit of H.264 is good enough.
Yeah.
And we need to keep that in mind when we push these speeds. You don't need a gigabit to a farmhouse in Scotland. What you need is 2 megabit per person in that house. At that point, they can download the Encyclopedia Britannica in 15 minutes, or they can and ingest the entire universe of information, or they can watch a couple of 15 minutes of video perfectly. And I think that if we concentrated on getting sort of 20 megabit out everywhere rather than worrying about getting gigabit 5G out anywhere, I think we'd do a lot better.
And that's a really good point, Dom, because here in the States, broadband was considered 2 megs a second up until recently. And
there's a history to that as well, because the 32 megabit was an analog transponder. It was one TV channel. Digitize it, you get 4. And that's why it all went down in sizes. So H.264 was there to target 2 megabit, and it does it.
And it also took it nicely back to the T1E1 space as well at 1.5 megs. Working in this agricultural technology piece as well as working in streaming, we're finding that one of the algorithms that we're looking to build is actually mapping where cell service is available on a farm, because if we have a drone that's doing particular things on the farm and there's no way for it to send the data back to the farmer, which you would assume it could just kick it out to a cell tower and back. But our topography, as David was saying, our topography is so bad that anytime you get down in between two mountains, you may have no cell service whatsoever. So now, Tamar, you're in a much smaller country. What is there sort of a digital divide as well, or has Israel consistently said we're going to push 10 megs a second or 20 megs a second out to everybody?
So it depends, and it's funny actually, because we've been house shopping, and it's literally you can have two houses next to each other on the same street, and one will easily have 100 gig and the one next to it will have 10. So it's relatively ahead of the curve, and people here tend to be very demanding technology wise. In the central areas around Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, you're going to have better infrastructure, and basically cable to the building is quite common now in many areas in Israel, but to the building. So if there's a building and, a private house right next door, then it won't get the faster internet. So it's really fascinating to see the discrepancies even on the same street in the same city.
You mentioned a topic that sort of goes along with this about during COVID, we had, of course, this bandwidth constraint, and David described it really well. You were wondering what the impact's going to be going forward post-COVID.
Right. So, as we all know, the European Commission issued demands basically to reduce the bandwidth reduction early in lockdown. I say it quietly. And that was something that we at Beamer actually really liked, because it's very much in line with our beliefs that you don't waste bits. You send out what you need to send out for a particular quality, for a particular content, but there's no need to just go to higher bit rates just because you can. And how to do that intelligently and use content adaptive approaches, perceptually driven content adaptive approaches is, our bread and butter. But what I think personally is that while in COVID it was a demand because of the increased usage, now we're kind of starting to hear the beginning of an awakening of, okay, but let's keep doing that to make a greener decision, because it's power consumption, it's a lot of carbon footprint to go to these extremely high bit rates, and there's much more awareness of the importance of reducing carbon footprint. So bit rates is one part of that, and another topic we also mentioned is the shift to more efficient implementations and devices and reducing footprint. And I guess that would transition us, if it's okay, to the new chips coming out. YouTube has introduced the Argus that has, as well as a GPU and a CPU, this new component of VCU, which is a video coding or transcoding unit. And this connects to what I think, Dom, you were saying earlier, that we're seeing shifts in the classic structure of things, where
chip structures.
Yeah, so there's more hardware, which was sort of felt like it was dying out and everything was going software. And I mean, Facebook announced, I think about 6 months back, a video dedicated chip. Now YouTube has one, and it looks like, and I believed that it's part of the same thing. So we're looking to reduce resource consumption, power consumption, reduce carbon footprint, and it's all different aspects of the same goal. So it's lower bit rates where possible. It's go to low cost, low power solutions where possible. And it's a very interesting trend.
It is interesting because it comes back to, these are not really making a difference to the consumer, but they are making a big difference for the infrastructure players. So you have to find a massive scale to really make some significant difference. But where you do, it leads to some really good, exciting innovation, which I think is what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah. Totally.
And I find the carbon footprint conversation interesting. It's something I've only become aware of really recently. We just did the official earthday.org live stream on Earth Day, and there was a big chunk in the middle of the programming talking about Earth definition. Don't watch things in HD if you don't need to. Watch them in Earth definition or standard definition, which is at mass is has a far lower carbon footprint in terms of the power required to transcode the content and that sort of thing. And I found it interesting that it was consumer targeted, that it was this message was aimed at reducing demand for higher definition content, which kind of flies in the face of this mission that we have in our industry to push for higher and higher definition and higher consumption rates of content and that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on that, Don?
Yeah, Tim and I've got a couple of sessions which are going to be quite strongly focused on sustainability at the Content Delivery Summit at the end of the month on the 25th. We've got Akamai going to be spending half an hour with us, a bit of a fireside chat, looking at a whole load of stuff that they've done across their infrastructure during pandemic growth and so on and so forth. And then we've got a bunch of the different, we always have a panel which looks at FPGA, DSP, GPU and CPU and how that balance is playing out and where the growth is. And it's becoming a really hot topic. We've been doing that for about a year. When we first did it, I think a few people were going, why would you use GPUs? You haven't got any clouds. And now everyone's going, forget the GPUs, we want FPGAs and DSPs because they're even more efficient. And it's bang, that's suddenly lit up, because I think the proposition to the consumer can only grow at a certain rate, but the proposition to the cost line is an alternative way of showing shareholders some value. And now it's something that is getting into the so Tim and I run a small forum called Greening of Streaming, and we're gradually gaining momentum with some interesting parties getting involved in the discussion there. As the momentum sort of builds, you can feel what it's being driven by is quarterly financial reporting. It's now a topic that the CEO or the COO wants to report, and that makes all the difference to whether people bother or not. it's great. I think it's a cool thing. It's got to be seen to be collaborative rather than competitive, which is complicated.
And I would think fundamentally, I mean, none of us disagree that we ought to be able to push higher resolutions, higher quality out. It's that question of sweet spot again. When we go back to the old days of looking at bandwidth was increasing, compression was getting better. The point is, let's hit that baseline. And Mark, I dropped off for a bit and I came back and heard you say something about earth quality, which sounds like a great definition.
You'd have loved that, Tim. Actually, Mark, it's worth saying that again for Tim, because
Earth definition is how they termed it, and they're really just talking about standard definition. If the content you're watching is available in HD, HDR, 4K, or SD, watch it in SD. And their point was, you're probably watching it on a mobile device, and you probably can't tell the difference between SD and HD, let alone 4K or higher. So watch it in SD and save the planet. And I found it interesting that there's a consumer-focused message about that at this point. It seems a little early to me, but it also seems like we need to start now if we're going to drive demand for that sort of
that's
change.
driving the interest at the public and the shareholder level rather than just at the architecture level. And
and it's funny, we really have pushed in the industry, the DCT based encoding, and there were a couple companies.
I'm going to cut in anyway with what I was going to say a minute ago, which is that the interesting thing about when we first postulated greeting and streaming last year at this Content Delivery Summit was it was very evident at that point that everyone thought it was someone else's problem. Actually, in the CDN environment, it usually ended up as being the CFO's problem, when they were dictating which infrastructure they were buying from. And at worst, it then became a carbon tax thing, where we'll plant a few trees in the cafe and call ourselves carbon neutral. And I think it's suddenly got on the radar that they can't pay it that sort of lip service, which is great. So, Tim, what are we going to wrap up on? We've got about 8 minutes left. We usually have a little roundup of what events are coming up, but I think you were talking about what people might think of as we start to feel the ice thaw around COVID. Maybe it's premature, I don't know, but as we start to feel the ice thaw a little, we were talking beforehand about what we thought the interesting inflection points in the industry might be or might not be. Maybe that's a good sort of quick roundup question, and then we'll have a little chat about what we're all doing over the next month. So, well, let me start that ball rolling with Tim. What do you think?
Well, if I'm still here, it seems like I'm dropping off and coming back. So just one last thought on what we were talking about earlier. Wavelet compression was something that really started to play in the industry about 12 years ago, to get us away from DCT, to be able to scale things up really nicely. I'm curious, Tamar, is there been any push toward looking at that kind of thing in terms of being able to...
I think it's been entirely replaced with AI. So I have this saying that, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we were saying wavelets would replace everything. We would do audio compression and denoising and recognition and everything with wavelets. And AI is the new wavelets. I think AI will take more because it's doing amazing stuff. But I think it's going to be like super active now. And then in 5 years, we're going to be using it in the right applications, but not trying to force it on everything.
Okay, fair enough. And in content and context-aware encoding, it's beautiful because, as we say, we don't need to raise the bits if we don't necessarily need them for a particular piece. So, Dom, for me, from an inflection point, I think people are going to, for a period of time, ditch their computers, ditch Zoom. I've heard the Zoom CEO say he has Zoom fatigue at this point. So if he has Zoom fatigue, we're all going to go outside for a couple months. Now, do I think that we've crossed the what was the thing, jumping the shark, the terminology in the business world years ago, where you essentially make it across the chasm, and streaming is the way to deliver content? Yes, I do think the pandemic did that for us. what it will mean in terms of mergers and acquisitions, what it will mean in terms of consolidation in the industry, and what it will mean in terms of building the new infrastructures that underlie all this. I think that, to me, is what I'm going to be paying attention to over the next probably 12 months, because I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation in the industry, just because if we, from a shareholder standpoint, if people kept seeing it rise and rise and rise, if it even just drops a tiny bit, I think a lot of the companies in our industry are going to get hammered because they're not meeting the shareholder expectation of doubling every 6 months or something like that. So I think M&A will become sort of a necessity in the industry.
In any particular sectors or industry-wide?
I don't necessarily think in the CDN space it will be, because they're going to, you've seen Akamai shift to where they're splitting it now. There's the media and delivery, and there's the security side. Fastly has some benefits there. There are a couple other companies in that space. And in fact, we'll talk a lot about that at CDS, which is coming up at the end of the month. I do think in terms of the player vertical, like we saw this week, you have JW Player acquiring Vualto. Vualto did DRM. They did delivery. And ultimately, I think what we're going to see is some consolidation there around 3 to 4 really good players in the market, so to speak. I also think we're going to see consolidation on the hardware encoding side, just because we seem to push really heavily to cloud for a period of time, and I think we're coming back to a more hybrid model, especially with things like AV1 where you have to have hardware. But I don't think there's enough business to sustain multiple hardware-based encoding companies. That's just my personal take. So,
interesting.
I would agree with you. Yeah, well, it depends on what we mean by hardware encoding companies. I mean, besides AWS, who is out there, making $30,000 to $60,000, hardware. I think you've got the little guys like Videon and companies like that are doing really innovative things in terms of single stream encoding for on-prem stuff for various sectors of many industries. I think one of the interesting things to note there is like Videon is now, with their next generation of hardware, they're building compute capabilities into their encoders with open APIs and supporting things like Python, and to enable AI and machine learning on the actual device itself to do things like image optimization or speech to text or object recognition, and things like that. So I think that's where the innovation lies for me. I think the bigger guys. I agree with you. I think that there's a swing back towards a hybrid model of hardware versus cloud, just because for one thing, for my money, everything I do is live. We do a ton of stuff in the cloud, but it does add latency to the workflow and to the signal path. So I think everyone knows where the cloud fits into their workflow and knows where it doesn't. And so I think there will, maybe not always, but I think for the time being, there will definitely be a place for hardware encoding in the market for sure.
And I think the small encoders, Mark, just to sort of finish that point out, the small encoders, especially you mentioned Videon, there's VTech, who was an Israeli company that I've done work with, who build fanless, really, that can work in really extreme environments. You're going to see a lot more computer vision going into industrial. And those companies who build those encoders will actually find those markets as well to be able to go into. So
I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of unpenetrated markets in that industry for sure.
Yeah.
David, what's your thoughts? What do you think is going to be the key inflection after the ice thaws, or as the ice thaws? Or do you think there's going to be none?
From an industry point of view, I think people are going to suddenly realize that content really is king. And I think there's going to be some rather serious licensing deals done for new content or existing content deals. Very quickly, I'm sure you're aware of the the European Super League that they nearly tried to do over here. Caused all sorts of trouble. And are we out of time?
No,
and I think that really threw a hand grenade under the lavatory door store. And I think the next round is going to be, especially after people start getting back out there and realizing there's no content available and stuff they've seen before, people start leaving existing publishers, and it will cause a bit of a, in my opinion, a bit of a tidal wave of going out there and trying to find either via acquisition or producing content, stuff that's actually worth watching. And let's face it, you only pay the money if the stuff's worth watching. Otherwise, you just bin it off. I certainly would.
Yeah. Tamar, what's your thoughts on
Well, I think hybrid is key. I think, like all of you mentioned, we're going to see companies hybriding together and merging. And I think hardware encoders is something we're going to see a lot. And as you mentioned, combination of hardware with ability to do AI for the processing, and combination of software, hardware chips, or chips with things that were more classically software oriented inside them. I think we're going to see hybrid in conferences. I know a lot of people, I'm among them, that attended more conferences this year than ever before because I don't like to travel. So I think we're hopefully, or maybe it's my hope speaking, we're going to learn to take the goods out of what happened in this past year and throw them in, and it won't go back to what it was before. That's my personal opinion. It will be some hybrid world in a lot of different aspects.
Good. That's very positive for everything. Tim.
I have to, on that note, I have to throw a plug in for Streaming Media Connect, which happens before your Content Delivery Summit. We just closed a survey Tuesday around enterprise video and what people liked about virtual conferences versus what they disliked. Really fascinating set. We're doing the analysis now. And Tamar, what you said is consistent. People are like, I've attended so many more conferences.
Oh, he's frozen up. Hold on, he can't freeze at that moment. There he is. He's back. Finish the sentence, Tim.
Yeah, that people were saying we love to try. We love not having to travel, but they also were saying we hate that we don't get a chance to catch up with people or do those personal interactions. So there's sort of this balance of, if I didn't have to go to a trade show to see all those people, I probably wouldn't go to the trade show itself. But I still need those interconnect points with people through video meetups or what have you. So
personally, I hope that we go back to a world where every exhibition is essentially in a bar, and they just have the exhibits around the side, and we cut out all the educational stuff, and we do that online before or after the event. That would suit me to the ground, especially if it was at the beach at IBC.
I don't believe you're alone, Dom, and I think that's where this is headed. At least if the large enterprise customers of ours that we're talking to are any indication, I think we'll go back to, in terms of industry events, we'll go back to smaller, very focused events like Streaming Media East, Streaming Media West, that sort of thing for our industry, or national sales meetings for large enterprise companies and that sort of thing. But I think the very large trade shows in our industry would be NAB and IBC. I think those are going to change very drastically and permanently. I don't think we're going to put thousands of people on planes anymore and put them in the same city, because it's just not efficient. And I think one of the big realizations of the past year has been that there's a much better way to get messaging out, to educate the industry, to do all the things that you try to do at a trade show, and then the model is kind of this vestige of the past that we just don't need to hang on to anymore. It's one of the few.
We can leave all the Goldman Sachs workers to get back to their offices while we have fun. Right. I think on that note, we need to wind it up. We've run over a couple of minutes, but I'd like to thank the little bit of heckling I had from Mark DJ, who's lurking in the chat room as well, as always. So good to see him tuned in. Thank you so much to David. I'm going to try and spotlight you as I do this, because otherwise I've got to get you to cough or something to get Zoom to switch to you. So thanks very much, David. It's been really good to
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll see you and speak to you more soon. And Tamar, thank you so much as well for all your algorithmic enlightenment and so on. That was wonderful.
It was a pleasure.
And Mark, we've gone profile with you. Why have we gone profile?
I wanted to give you the sitcom thumbs up. Huh?
I'll have to get the fake laughter out as well.
Right? Yeah.
But, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Something will go wrong. Where's Tim gone? I've lost Tim. There's Tim.
Oh, I'm here. I'm
Tim,
still in front of the map. So
you're back to the fields and using AI video cameras to work out whether you've milked the cow enough.
Exactly. Yeah, pretty much. No, I'm working on goats to start with. I'll move my way up to cats. So
I might have to clip that audio sample out of this YouTube and reuse it at an appropriate moment. So we'll leave you to starting on the goats. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. I've been Don Robinson. This has been Stream Media Advanced Forum, and we'll be back next month.